Halloween was an unusual time in the old neighborhood back in the day. Back in the day being the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. It was farm country. The only residents there were farmers and their families. Instead of busy streets lined on both sides with dozens or hundreds of houses, there were quiet country roads lined with stone wall fences, big old maple, oak, and locust trees, and every half mile to a mile, a farmhouse, a barn, and assorted outbuildings. Therefore, when trick-or-treat night came around, you never saw herds of trick-or-treaters marching the roads in the time-honored annual search for candy. There just wasn't that many of us, and the few that were knew darn well that walking miles at night to get half a dozen candy bars was most definitely not worth the effort. Of course, there were a few generous moms that would take some of the lucky ones out in cars to friends and relatives scattered about the towns, and after a long evening, they'd return with a very modest bag of treats. No, Halloween in the old neighborhood was short on treats, but long on tricks. And you should know, those tricks were not the exclusive domain of the younger generation. Far from it. In our old neighborhood, Halloween pranks were an adult sport. Most famous of all pranks was decorating the center of the village of Montgomery with contraband collected over the previous few weeks from all over the township. Political campaign signs, junk, various household items, and even outhouses were meticulously arranged together in an impressive display to celebrate the holiday. It was a community collaboration of adults that was expected, looked forward to, and enjoyed every Halloween. There were also less-known individually performed pranks scattered about the neighborhood. Most of them involved creative uses of toilet paper and eggs, the usual Halloween stuff. Perhaps the most memorable was my grandfather's prank on the hired hand. He secretly dumped out the contents of the man's pack of beechnut chewing tobacco and replaced them with dried cow manure. Speaking of cow manure, that brings me to the main part of this story. It was probably the most famous prank ever in the old neighborhood. At least the most famous that I remember. Actually, I believed it happened sometime before I was born, but since it had such neighborhood notoriety, it was still a prominent tale, told long after the participants had long passed into history. Well, now, first you have to get an idea of the lay of the land as it was back in our particular part of the town of Montgomery, in southeastern New York, about 80 miles north of downtown Manhattan, about 15 miles west of the Hudson River, and smack dab in the middle of the old Wallkill River Valley. If you came down from the north from Beamer Road, that ran out of the west side of the village of Walden and onto Mills Road, you'd first go past Jean Rue's boarding house and tenant farm. Half a mile later, after going around two sharp turns, you'd pass our place, the Score Farm. Mills Road went south from us for another half mile until it ended at East Searsville Road. Right there, you'd be at the Marcy Farm. If you turned right at that junction, it would take you next past Sam Gonick's chicken house on the left and then Marcy's house on the right. After that, East Searsville wound off to the southwest past the farm of Lewis Andrews and his son Elliot. The next farm was that of Lewis's brother, Harvey Andrews, the victim of the prank. Now, just past Harvey was the farm of the Comfort brothers, Hype, Pete, and Russell, and Sister Dorothy, but don't concern yourself with them just yet. As with everyone else in the neighborhood, they knew what was going on, but thankfully for them had nothing to do with the prank. Now, just before you got to the Comfort's driveway, there was a road to the left called Mud Lane. Follow that for about a quarter mile, and it ends at River Road and Donald Rowe's farm. If you turned right, you would head south past the Vanderley farm and eventually end up at the bridge in the village of Montgomery. However, you're not going to do that because the Vanderleys in the village of Montgomery had nothing to do with this prank either, although I have suspicions about Donald Rowe. Instead, turn left and north on River Road for about half a mile. That will bring you just past Harry Brock's farm and his pond. This pond just happens to be right off the shoulder of the road an important factor of this tale. Now, just a mile further north on River Road, past Johnny Hawkins' farm. Johnny had nothing to do with it either. He was just too nice a guy to pull a prank on anyone. That was the northeastern end of East Searsville Road. If you turned left onto it, you'd end up half a mile later at the Marcy farm and once again at the southern end of Mills Road. I just took you on a counterclockwise, circular tour of this particular part of the neighborhood in which the prank, or crime as Harvey considered it, took place. Just prior to Halloween, this particular year, Harvey Andrews purchased a brand new manure spreader. If for that fact alone there would be no tale to tell, but instead there were in fact 3 other facts. First of all, Harvey always parked his manure spreader conveniently and directly under the manure chute at the end of his barn. The end of his barn just happened to be only a few feet off the shoulder of East Searsville Road and very close up in plain sight. Second, Harvey had an extremely direct, loud, unpredictable, and explosive demeanor. You always knew where you stood with Harvey, and you simply did not mess with that man. Finally, Harvey made it unquestionably clear when he proclaimed to the entire neighborhood that his brand new manure spreader would be parked in its usual spot on Halloween night, and it had better still be there the following morning. And he and his shotgun would be sitting in his kitchen window waiting and watching. For 2 scheming young men, such as Harvey's nephew, Elliot Andrews, and my father, Ralph Score, these facts and this proclamation were the equivalent of game on. They waited until the witching hour of that fateful night before they enacted their plan. Driving up in a pickup truck, whose I don't remember, they stopped about 100 yards down the road from the barn with lights off. The 2 wannabe ninjas stealthily snuck past the barn up to Harvey's house and peeked in the kitchen window. As promised, Harvey was there, shotgun in hand, but sound asleep. Just as they both had figured would be the situation. They returned to the truck and, as quickly and as quietly and as humanly and mechanically possible, they backed up to the manure spreader, hooked onto it, and sped off into the night. Well, only about 2 miles down the road, to the Marcy Farm barnyard. After unhooking the manure spreader there, the 2 young manure spreader thieves triumphantly returned to their respective homes. But, unknown to them, the night's devilry was just getting started. There was another young neighborhood prankster with another scheme up his farmer's shirt sleeve. To get to Marcy's barnyard, Elliot and my father had to go past Marcy's house, where one of their neighborhood contemporaries, Charlie Marcy, was also waiting and watching. Actually, as neighborhood lore goes, some say Charlie was supposedly in on the plot. Some say he was miffed because he was left out of it. Some, and I place my bet on this one, say he was not too enthused about suffering the wrath of Harvey the next morning if it was found where it was left. Whoever you believed on that matter really doesn't matter on the dusty pages of history. Charlie simply seized an opportunity and wrote his own history. All that is known for sure is sometime after Ralph Score and Elliot Andrews were back home and sound asleep, Charlie Marcy hooked his pickup truck onto the contraband manure spreader sitting in his barnyard, motored on down East Searsville Road, on up River Road to Harry Brock's farm, the one with the pond right on the side of the road. Right at the end of that pond was a little pull-off where Charlie quickly pulled off into. Then, whether from a stroke of genius or a very stupid idea, Charlie decided to back the manure spreader into the pond. He got out, pulled the hitch pin, casually drove home pretending nothing had ever happened. Now, one more twist to the plot. Mother Nature and physics joined together to add their part. Charlie had left the spreader with its wheels about axle deep in water and its drawbar on dry land. However, those wheels were right at the edge of a submerged bank that dropped quickly into much deeper water. Shortly after Charlie had left the scene, a brisk autumn breeze came out of the north, just strong enough. to give the spreader a slight nudge. Seconds later, all that could be seen was the tip of the spreader's drawbar peeking above the water. Daylight. The following morning, November 1st, Halloween was in the books, sort of. Trick-or-treaters everywhere had removed their masks and returned to their less ghoulish world. And, in the old neighborhood, it was time to go back to the business of farming. That meant everyone was busy doing their morning milking. Everyone except Harvey. He was standing at the very spot where his brand new manure spreader was sitting the night before, and he was doing a not-so-slow burn. Going through his mind was a list of the neighborhood's usual suspects, and first on that list was his nephew, Elliot. After all, he was family, and the next farm down the road. Moments later, uncle and nephew were going through what you might say was the manure hitting the fan. Well, Halloween was over. The prank had been pulled. Elliot came clean. Harvey cooled off. The status quo was about to return to East Searsville Road. His uncle and nephew set out for Marcy's barnyard. Of course, this all changed once they arrived to find the spreader was gone. Once again, the manure hit the fan. Harvey made a subtle reference to shotguns and a not-so-subtle threat to involve the police if his brand-new manure spreader wasn't returned before it was needed for the first time that afternoon. Elliot's next move was a frantic phone call to my father, and the search for the spreader began. Even though Harry Brock had to walk right past his pond as he crossed River Road to go to his morning milking, and even though the pond was right outside his kitchen window, neither he nor his wife noticed anything peculiar sticking out of that pond. However, quite mysteriously and more suspiciously, Don Rao, remember that other farmer up the road who I wasn't sure about, happened along about first light and immediately noticed the out-of-place manure spreader drawbar. Adding to that suspicion, and adding fuel to the fire as well, he never said a word to anyone. Much to the amusement of Mr. Rao, as well as that of Charlie Marcy, tensions in the neighborhood escalated exponentially. Elliot was feeling the heat from Uncle Harvey. My father at this point was feeling the heat also, not from Harvey, but rather from his own anger. He smelled a rat and was damn certain he knew who, and that rat, Charlie, was conveniently absent that morning. By noon there was blood on the wind. Uncle Harvey was about to come down hard on Elliot. My father had just about enough. He rushed over to the Andrews farm and held a council of war of sorts with a now equally angered Elliot. They knew someone close was responsible and went down soul by soul of their list of usual suspects. Charlie was at the top of that list, but Charlie was nowhere to be found. Second on that list, sure enough, was Donald Rao, and he just happened to be home. It was getting late. Manure spreading time in the neighborhood was approaching. There was a very assertive knock on Donald's door. The two, usually neighborly visitors, wanted answers, particularly one answer. Where was that damn manure spreader? Donald could be a mischievous soul, but also, most of the time, knew when he was outgunned. My father and Elliot, when pressed, were also not men to mess with. Donald came clean. Within half an hour, Harvey's brand new manure spreader was back in its proper spot, a bit soggy, but as they say, no worse for wear. Weeks passed. The old neighborhood was once again at peace. No one was arrested. No one was shot. Harvey Andrews' manure spreader became the most celebrated icon of East Searsville Road. Charlie never fessed up until one day when he needed a favor from Hype Comfort, the neighborhood go-to fix-it man. Remember the Comforts, the other family that had nothing to do with the prank? Hype was also a close friend of the Andrews and my father, and some say distantly related to both. That's the thing about those old small family farm neighborhoods. The only things that get around faster than contraband manure spreaders are gossip, woodpile relationships, and a nosy Donald Rao.